Cornelius Conn, Page, an Australian coastwatcher and plantation manager on Tabor Island, 20 miles north of New Ireland, reported over his radio one sweltering day in mid-January 1942 that a Japanese plane had flown past Tabor on its way to Rabaul on the Australian-administered island of New Britain. On January 20th, a few days later, he reported two formations of 100 Japanese fighters and bombers en route to Rabaul. The Japanese ultimately executed Page. "We salute you who are about to die." When the Japanese planes arrived, two of the Royal Australian Air Force's, RAAF No. 24, Squadron's 8 outdated Wirraway fighters were on patrol at 15,000 feet over Rabaul. They launched an instant attack on the bombers, but they were swiftly shot down by the far more powerful Japanese Zero fighters who were accompanying them. Desperate to get height to attack the Japanese, the squadron's 6 surviving Wirraways took off. 2 of them crash-landed, covered in bullets, 1 crashed after takeoff, and the Zeros shot down 2 more over the ocean. The port, the airfield, the coastal batteries, and an oil tanker in the harbor were all attacked and strafed, and 1 survived, its guns empty, to land among falling bombs. The Japanese onslaught had reached the South Pacific less than 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor. The RAAF commander at Rabaul, Wing Commander John Leroux, radioed headquarters to request reinforcements of modern fighters. Unfortunately, HQ was unable to provide him with any fighters. He was instructed to strike a highly escorted Japanese convoy of transports bound for Rabaul the following evening, most likely transporting an invasion force, using any aircraft he could get into the air. Nos morituri te salutamus, the Roman gladiator's salutation means, "We who are about to die salute you." Leroux signaled headquarters in Latin, loading his last Lockheed Hudson with bombs, before launching an attack on a Japanese fleet consisting of 2 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, and over a dozen destroyers and transports. Luckily for Leroux and his crew, a dark night descended, and he decided to abandon the operation because he couldn't see the fleet and his fuel was running low. Getting ready for the New Guinea invasion. A Japanese carrier fleet's planes raided Kavieng on New Ireland and Lae, Salamaua, Bulolo, and Madang on the mainland of New Guinea on January 21st. The 1,400-man Australian garrison was swiftly overrun by 5,300 Marines and troops from the South Seas Force, the Nankai, who landed at Rabaul on January 23rd. 2/3 of the Australians were captured, 160 were killed after surrendering, and 400 managed to flee to the opposite coast and be evacuated by ship to the mainland of New Guinea after marching across the rugged, jungle-covered mountains of New Britain. The Japanese made landfall at New Ireland on January 23rd as well. After destroying their stores and the airstrip, the small garrison of independent company soldiers, who were the British equivalent of a commando, boarded a small ship and set off for Australia, all of them suffering from severe malaria. Japanese planes found them, strafed them, and took them hostage at Rabaul. General Harukichi Hyakutake, the Japanese commander at Rabaul, promptly set about transforming Rabaul and the Gazelle Peninsula into a stronghold, complete with air and naval bases, as well as a headquarters for operations in the South Pacific. In order to break sea and air ties between the United States and Australia, launch additional seaborne operations, and launch airstrikes on northern Australia, he assigned Maj Daunj General Tomitaro Horii command of an invasion fleet to seize Port Moresby on the southern coast of Papua. Burma, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, Port Moresby and Papua, the Solomon Islands, New Caledonia, Fiji, Samoa, and finally the Central Pacific back to Japan were all part of the Japanese overarching strategy to surround the region. It was believed that this large region could be protected and guarded with the help of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and that it would supply Japan with the resources it needed, including lumber, minerals, oil, and rubber. It would join the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which is led by Japan. The Australian continent stood in Japan's way. In what is known as Australia's Pearl Harbor, a Japanese carrier force launched 2 airstrikes on Darwin in the Northern Territory of Australia on February 19, 1942. resulting in significant damage and the sinking of 8 ships in the harbor. The attacks claimed the lives of 243 civilians, and nearly 100 more airstrikes would follow in 1942-1943. Beginning in early April 1942, the British acquired control of Sumatra and the Indian Ocean region, while the United States took control of the entire Pacific region, with the exception of Sumatra in the Dutch East Indies. General Douglas MacArthur, who had traveled from the Philippines to Australia, controlled the Southwest Pacific Area, SWPA, while Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had his headquarters in Hawaii, oversaw the North, Central, and South Pacific. The Solomon Islands served as the boundary between their separate domains, and MacArthur's ground forces and Nimitz's naval forces would need to respond to a Japanese attack there. Japanese air and ground forces gathered at Rabaul in preparation for the attack on Port Moresby and the capture of the Solomon Islands Tulagi Island for use as a seaplane base. A carrier attack force prepared to thwart any American intervention would be behind the amphibious forces headed for the 2 assaults. It included an escort of cruisers and destroyers, as well as the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. The Coral Sea Battle. The Japanese landed on Tulagi on May 3, 1942, and seized the island without resistance. A Japanese destroyer was sunk the following day by aircraft from the American carrier Yorktown. In an attempt to overtake the American carrier force, the Japanese carrier group, led by Admiral Takeo Takagi, now moved south, passing east of the Solomons and into the Coral Sea. In the meantime, Yorktown and the carrier Lexington had united, and they were heading north to stop the Japanese invasion force as it headed to Port Moresby. Even though they were barely 70 miles apart at one point, the opposing carrier groups searched for one another on May 6th without making contact. Admiral Takagi launched a bombing attack on the American carrier and cruiser after Japanese search planes reported seeing them on the 7th. It was discovered that the 2 sunk ships were just an escorting destroyer and a tanker. In the meantime, the light carrier Shoho was sunk by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's Yorktown, which assaulted the Japanese force en route to Port Moresby. The Japanese delayed their attack on Port Moresby as a result of this ship disaster, and the invasion force retreated towards Rabaul. The 2 opposing carrier forces collided in the Coral Sea, off the coast of Queensland, Australia, early on May 8th. They were a good combination. The Americans had 122 aircraft, while the Japanese had 121, with 4 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers for the Japanese and 5 heavy cruisers and 7 destroyers for the Americans. Their escorts were about equal in strength. However, the Americans had to work under a clear sky while the Japanese were traveling in a belt of clouds. Throughout the morning, a combat broke out between the planes of the 2 carrier forces. The conflict was noteworthy because it was the first time opposing carriers' planes engaged in a large-scale naval battle without the opposing fleets ever getting a chance to engage. The Japanese carrier Shokaku was struck by 3 bombs and pulled out of the fight, but the carrier Zuikaku managed to evade detection due to the cloud cover. The majority of the crew was saved after Lexington, a beloved carrier her sailors dubbed Lady Lex, was forced to be abandoned after being struck by 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs on the American side. Only 1 bomb struck Yorktown. In terms of aircraft losses, 74 versus over 80, and personnel, 543 versus over 1,000 Japanese, the Americans fared slightly better. However, the Japanese only lost a light carrier, while the Americans lost a fleet carrier. Above all, however, the Japanese had been prevented from achieving their strategic goal, which was to seize Port Moresby. The Milne Bay garrison. In the afternoon, Nimitz gave the order for his carrier force to leave the Coral Sea since the threat to Port Moresby had temporarily disappeared. Because they thought both American carriers had been sunk, the Japanese likewise withdrew. Numbered Unit 75 Squadron RAAF, which flew 17 American-supplied Curtiss Kitty Hawk fighters, was in continuous action for 44 days during this period, either defending Port Moresby from Japanese air attacks that sought to destroy its air defenses, or, under the command of squadron leader John Jackson, conducting raids on Lae and other Japanese-held airfields. 12 Australian pilots were killed or reported missing, and 50 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in the air or on the ground. Jackson's brother Leslie took over as commanding officer of RAAF No. 75 Squadron after his death on April 28th. That same day, with only 3 Kitty Hawks remaining in action, the squadron was replaced by 2 American Bell Air Cobra squadrons of No. 35 Group USAAF. A double push was used by the Japanese in their subsequent effort to seize Port Moresby. One force would march from the north coast of Papua New Guinea, drop on Port Moresby on the south coast, and cross the Owen Stanley Range of steep jungle-covered highlands. A seaborne offensive along the southern coast to Port Moresby was to be launched from Milne Bay, which is located on the eastern edge of Papua. As the starting point for their offensives, the Japanese captured Buna and Gona on the north coast of Papua in mid-July, marking the beginning of these campaigns. Between the mountains and the sea, Milne Bay is a slender strip of land that is rarely wider than 2 miles, and occasionally only a few hundred yards wide. It's a natural harbor, the vast bay. There were a few plantations, indigenous settlements, and a mission establishment there at the time. There was a lot of rain there, and mosquitoes carrying malaria and a host of other insects swarmed. Since late June, American and Australian forces had been establishing a forward airbase there. The Australian 7th Brigade Group, consisting of 3 militia battalions under the command of Brigadier John Field, strengthened the base after Buna and Gona were overrun by the Japanese. Before the war, Field was a mechanical engineer and lecturer at a university. During the Libyan campaign, he led a battalion of the Australian Imperial Force, AIF. His professional expertise was crucial in building a system of defenses, roads, bridges, port facilities, 2 airfields, and other infrastructure from the ground up. In August, the veteran 18th Brigade of the AIF, led by Brigadier George F. Wootten, who had distinguished himself during the siege of Tobruk, once again reinforced the garrison. As additional reinforcements approached, Major General Cyril Clowes, a regular officer who had led the Anzac Corps artillery during the Greek campaign months earlier and received the Distinguished Service Order and Military Cross in World War I, assumed command of the region. He had 1824 men under his command at the end of August 1942, including 1365 Americans and 7459 Australians. RAAF squadrons 75 and 76, led by squadron leaders Leslie Jackson and Peter Turnbull, provided them with support. Japanese tanks versus Australian military. Coast watchers and spy planes detected a Japanese seaborne force heading toward Milne Bay on August 25th with an advance flotilla of 7 barges. RAAF pilots were unable to taxi their aircraft away from their dispersal sites because Milne Bay was under air attack at the time this was reported. However, the RAAF planes immediately took off and swooped down on the barges with bombs and cannon fire after the Japanese bombers left. Many of the soldiers in the barges were killed when they sank the majority of them and injured the others. Not far behind was the main Japanese invasion fleet. It had 3 cruisers and 2 minesweepers, tankers, troop ships, and destroyers apiece. The convoy started disembarking troops that night after sneaking into Milne Bay. Major General Clowes had positioned his forces to guard the base, alternating AIF veterans with less experienced militia men. Positioned between 2 7th Brigade militia battalions, the Tui 10th AIF Battalion was in charge of the eastern sector and held the Gili-Gili region. The last militia unit and the 2 other 18th Brigade AIF battalions were assigned to the western sector. About 800 Japanese Marines, aided by light tanks, went ashore on August 26 before daylight. They were confronted by the Australian militia in the KB. Despite being hampered by the lack of anti-tank rifles or weapons, Mission and Cameron Springs were able to combat the tanks with sticky bombs, which did not adhere to the tanks due to the humidity and wetness. As dawn broke, they saw that the Japanese had landed and had stacked stores and fuel along the shore. On the shore, empty landing barges were dragged up. The RAAF Kitty Hawks sprang into action right once, shooting up everything in their path amid a barrage of anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese ships and beach positions. Both sides solidified their positions during the remainder of the day, and the Japanese Marines who had been reinforced launched another attack that evening. Confused fighting continued until 4 a.m. in the low moonlight, with one squad wading neck-deep in the sea to avoid the Australians on one side, and another group splashing through mangrove swamps or moving silently through forest to try to turn the other flank. The Marines employed the flanking tactics that had worked so well in Malaya. Oars, hand-to-hand combat. When the first of the AIF battalions relieved the 61st Militia Battalion on the morning of August 27, 1942, it was nearly worn out from bearing the brunt of the action since the first Japanese landing. It was assumed that 2,000 or more Japanese soldiers had landed based on the noises of landing barges heard during the night. When the dawn rose, it revealed that 6 more Japanese ships had entered the bay. General Clowes was worried that more Japanese landings might occur south of Gili Gili, a region for which he lacked reinforcements, because the airfields, dock installations, and supply depots were all situated close to Gili Gili. So, until he could be certain of Japanese intentions, he was proceeding cautiously. General MacArthur chastised him for being cautious, believing that Clowes ought to have immediately forced the Japanese back into the sea. The AIF 2 Defile 10th Battalion entered the KB's defenses in the late afternoon of August 27th. Mission. Approximately 500 of them had previously engaged in combat against the German Afrika Korps in the North African sun, sand, and rocks. Now, around 8 p.m., the Japanese stormed the Australian perimeter while singing to instill dread in their foes amidst darkness, blinding rain, and thick muck. With tank support, the infantry launched themselves recklessly into the Australian fortifications, and the Australians soon found themselves engaged in hand-to-hand combat as the conflict turned into a jumble of individual and group battles. The Australians were told to evacuate to the Gamma River's west bank at midnight. The Australians were able to hold them there after the Japanese pursued them so closely that they were forced to retreat over the river to the area around No. 3 airstrip, which was guarded by the 25th Militia Battalion. The military of Australia maintains. With the exception of artillery exchanges and intense patrols by both sides surrounding No. 3 airstrip, the following 2 days were relatively quiet. Brigadier Wooten's 18th Brigade prepared to attack and push the Japanese back along the north coast as far as the KB mission, and to sweep the entire peninsula, but this was called off on August 29th as 9 destroyers and a Japanese cruiser swooped into view. The Japanese attempted to strengthen their hold on the airfield area the following day, but the Australians kept them out, and the two sides were in continuous communication. They received assistance from the 2 Kitty Hawk squadrons that flew nearly non-stop sorties, functioning as flying artillery and strafing the Japanese from treetop height. They destroyed the Japanese' supplies and equipment, caused significant losses, and held the Japanese pinned down. The 61st Battalion, which was guarding the northeast border, was the target of 3 fierce Japanese attacks early on August 31st. The militia members pushed the Japanese back, leaving many dead and injured on the muddy terrain. Clowes brought up the 1st of Wooten's brigade to counterattack because he was certain that the Japanese were focusing their efforts along the eastern sector or north shore at daybreak. The militia fighters battled their way through a number of ambushes throughout the day, demonstrating that they were more than capable of repelling the Japanese as they drove them back through wet foliage and slippery muck until they eventually overran the KB. As darkness fell, the mission was at bayonet point. Australians who had positioned themselves along the Gamma River were ambushed by 300 Japanese from behind. They roared and chanted as they rushed out of the jungle at dusk. For 2 hours, opponents slithered and splashed in knee-deep mud during a bewildered and brutal battle in slashing rain. The Japanese were severely mauled and then retreated. As the opposition tried to retreat west, the Australians came in to finish them off. Anticipate Japanese ground forces attacking Milne Bay aerodromes. On September 1st, 1942, at 9 a.m., Clowes got an urgent communication from General MacArthur, who would later chastise him for being too cautious. Clowes believed that he now had the Japanese on the run and intended to continue his advance and mop up the stragglers. Expect Japanese ground forces to attack Milne Bay aerodromes from the west and northwest, backed by destroyer fire from the bay, according to the telegram. Take stations right away. Every unit readied itself to stave off this assault, yet it never came. Wotton's forces launched a counteroffensive 2 days later, but the Japanese were able to establish themselves in well-defended positions because of the delay. In a series of actions similar to the one Corporal J.A. French participated in, the Australians had to force them out of each position. 3 Japanese machine gun positions were firing on a column of soldiers that the French were leading. After telling the soldiers to seek cover, he scudded near enough to use explosives to take out 2 of the positions, before charging the 3rd and firing a Thompson from the hip. A barrage of gunshots struck him. Despite being mortally wounded, he continued to move and shoot until he died at the spot. The fact that Corporal French had killed the personnel of all 3 machine gun positions contributed significantly to the attack's successful finish and helped to limit Australian fatalities. He received a Victoria Cross posthumously. Clowes started mopping up operations after he was certain his soldiers had stopped the Japanese attack. The Japanese soldiers, who were starved and tired, battled until the very end. Because they refused to surrender, they had to be slaughtered. Slim's praise and MacArthur's criticism. The battle for Milne Bay ended 2 weeks after the initial landing. The Japanese had lost badly, their first defeat on land, in part due to their mistake of assuming that Milne Bay would only be defended by 2 or 3 companies of soldiers who were sent in to defend the airfields, and expecting to defeat them with ease with about 2,000 Marines and soldiers, in part due to the excellent support provided by the 2 RAAF squadrons, but primarily due to the tenacity of the young militia soldiers who dispelled the Japanese Army's myth of invincibility. However, the only criticism directed to Maj, General Clowes, came from Supreme Commander MacArthur, who chastised him for not sending back a consistent flow of information and condemned how Clowes handled the operations at Milne Bay. There was no mention of the false information that MacArthur and his headquarters had given Clowes. If MacArthur had permitted a senior, combat-savvy Australian commander to serve on his staff, many of the disagreements and miscommunications that developed, and still exist today, between the 2 forces could have been prevented. However, he refused to do so. Field Marshal Viscount William Slim, who commanded the British 14th Army in Burma at the time, praised the battle for Milne Bay. We were also helped by a very cheering piece of news that now reached us, and of which, as a morale booster, I made great use of, he wrote in his book, Defeat into Victory. In August and September of 1942, Australian troops delivered the Japanese their first definitive land defeat at Milne Bay in New Guinea. We could have done it if the Australians had, under circumstances very similar to our own. Some people might forget that Australian soldiers were the first to break the Japanese Army's aura of invincibility among all the Allies. Those of us who were in Burma have reason to remember. The 7th Brigade's militia soldiers, known as Chocos, or Chocolate Soldiers, as some AIF veterans refer to men in pretty uniforms who had no intention of engaging in actual combat, had already undergone their baptism of fire at Milne Bay. On a native route that became known as the Kokoda Trail, young troops from a smaller militia unit, the 39th Battalion, were suffering their own baptism of fire farther to the west, in the fearful territory of the Owen Stanley Range of Papua New Guinea. Decapitations in Kokoda. Along with 1,200 Rabaul natives who would serve as porters and laborers, 1,800 combat men from the Japanese South Seas, forces Nankai arrived on the north coast of Papua on July 21st. They landed at the Anglican Mission Building and Hospital in the local community of Gona. In a valley in the foothills of the Owen Stanley Mountains, some 90 kilometers by air from Gona, the combat soldiers immediately launched an inland assault for Kokoda, an Australian government outpost, airfield, native hamlet, and a sizable, privately owned rubber plantation. The Rabaul natives and the supply and base troops started constructing bases at Gona and Buna, a tiny government outpost and native settlement a few kilometers down the coast from Gona. More Japanese arrived at Gona and Buna, bringing the total to roughly 13,500, and began to round up all of the local Westerners. Papuans exposed several individuals in hiding at Sangara to the Japanese, and 2 Anglican nursing sisters and a 7-year-old boy were among those who were executed by the sword on Buna Beach. 5 Australian soldiers and 5 American airmen from a downed plane encountered a priest and 2 Gona sisters who were sheltering in the woods. With the exception of Father Benson, the priest, who managed to flee, was apprehended and was taken as a prisoner to Rabaul. All of them were betrayed and murdered by the Japanese. One by one, the 6-year-old boy, 3 ladies, and 5 other men in another mission group were decapitated. 2 mission ladies were standing next to open graves nearby when they were repeatedly bayoneted till they died within. Japanese ambush. A route that showed up on their maps as a road to Kokoda and then on to Port Moresby on the south coast was followed by the Japanese combat soldiers advancing on Kokoda. The road was actually only a track, a local route that started in the malaria-infested swamps next to Gona, crossed a plain of kunai grass that could reach a height of 2 meters, and entered the Owen Stanley Mountains foothills and the Kokoda Valley. Kokoda was 400 meters above sea level and surrounded by breathtaking 2,000-meter-high mountains. When the Japanese combat troops encountered 11 platoon B Company 39th Militia Battalion, together with an Australian officer and a few local men from the Pacific Islands Battalion, they encountered their initial resistance close to Awala, at Wairopai, where a footbridge was hung on a wire cable across the Kamusi River. The name Wairapi was pidgin for wire rope. The Australians and native forces withdrew, hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. When the Japanese attempted to cross the river, the fleeing Australians attacked them and destroyed the bridge. The Australians retreated to Garari when the Japanese started to encircle them, and 12 platoon from Kokoda joined them there. The Japanese launched an ambush near Garari Creek, but the Australians were forced to retreat once more to Oivi, where fierce combat broke out, because the Japanese were simply too powerful and accustomed to fighting in this kind of terrain. The Bloody Track. Lieutenant Colonel William T. Owen sent his final company to Oivi and radioed for 2 additional companies of his battalion to be flown in from Port Moresby at 39th Battalion headquarters at Kokoda. After several months of constructing defenses and trenches in and around Port Moresby, the 39th Battalion, a militia battalion with limited military training, was ordered to relocate to the North Shore in order to keep an eye out for potential Japanese landings in the region. While others were still having difficulty along the Kokoda Trail, Colonel Owen and his battalion headquarters and B Company marched over it from Port Moresby and arrived at Kokoda. Half a platoon was flown in on a private aircraft, and 16 platoon, D Company, hobbled into Kokoda the following day. The Kokoda Trail started at the Port Moresby end and led up a steep spur on the Imita Range after a mile of walking alongside the Goldie River. When soldiers arrived at the summit, they were shocked by the difficulty of the ascent and panting for oxygen, only to discover that this was just the beginning. Range after range of identical geography was in front of them, the mountains and ranges covered in jungles growing higher and higher till they reached the distant horizon. Valleys, cracks, and folds shot out randomly to every point of the compass, many of them mist-filled. Since distance was measured in time, rather of yards and miles, they had little choice but to stutter on for hours on end. How long would it take them to reach the next staging post, rest spot, or tent site? The Kokoda Trail, or the Bloody Track, as the Australian soldiers dubbed it, was poked and jabbed through it all, heading roughly north. Climbing a mountainside above a raging torrent, moving from rock to rock in a swift-moving mountain stream, wading through foul-smelling marsh up to their waists, and frequently climbing a slope that was only a few degrees off vertical before descending a similar bone-jarring, ankle-twisting slope on the other side, are all examples of this. Snakes, spiders, leeches, mosquitoes, and other insects were all present, along with persistently high humidity and rain, slimy mud that never went away, and bitterly chilly evenings. Malaria, typhoid, dysentery, and minor scratches that swiftly developed into tropical ulcers were among the many diseases that soon spread. the Kokoda Fall. Now the situation was dire in Oivi, a 2-hour march from Kokoda. As night fell, B Company Commander Captain Sam Templeton slipped into the forest to locate reinforcements arriving from Kokoda and guide them back in. After a few minutes, there was a shot, followed by silence. Templeton vanished from view. The officers made the decision to leave Oivi that evening because they were certain they would not be able to resist the next significant Japanese attack. They later moved slowly through the black jungle to arrive in Kokoda the following morning, guided by the native soldiers, with each soldier carrying a webbing strap from the belt of the soldier in front of him. Colonel Owen, meanwhile, had withdrew to Diniki, where a hill offered a robust, organic defensive position, with fewer than 50 soldiers to protect Kokoda, the airstrip, and the path. Owen alerted Port Moresby that the airfield was open, brought all the troops back to Kokoda, and once more requested reinforcements and supplies when B Company arrived from Oivi. However, the Japanese launched a mortar barrage into Kokoda that evening across the Mambare River, and 400 infantry attacked the Australians while heavy machine guns provided cover. The Japanese poured in more troops and increased mortar and machine gun fire throughout the offensive, which caused the Australians to retreat to Diniki. Owen was shot in the head while hurling a grenade at Japanese soldiers who were approaching him through the night fog. Alongside him, Bren Gunner, Private Snowy Parr, furious at the death of a well-liked and respected CO, went off into the night with his number 2, Private Rusty Hollow, seeking revenge. They discovered 15 Japanese people. Parr used the Bren to shoot them at close range, eliminating them. The retreat to Diniki was then joined by him and Hollow, bringing the Japanese out. Meanwhile, C Company had reached Diniki, and A Company arrived the following day. Then D and E Companies showed up with Lieutenant Cole, Alan Cameron, Owen's temporary CO. Cameron made the decision to retake Kokoda while the Japanese were waiting for reinforcements for the next phase of their attack. The 39th was once again a battalion with 480 men in all ranks. The Japanese were drawn out of Kokoda by a false attack and withdrawal to Diniki, and Wolfati Kolzur Tsukamoto, their commander, devoted his whole force to attacking Diniki. A and D companies of the 39th went behind the Japanese and entered a deserted Kokoda while the battle was underway. They gave Port Moresby the indication that the runway was once more open and that supplies and reinforcements should be deployed right away. After that, they got ready for the Japanese to return. They waited all day, but neither supplies nor reinforcements showed up. Ultimately, the Japanese returned in a downpour, and the Australians repelled them during the night and the following day. With the rest of the two companies following closely behind, the Australians tied their injured onto handmade stretchers and, with 8 soldiers per stretcher, dragged them across the plateau and up the steep slopes in the dark as night fell. 2 Allied planes were dumping supplies on the airfield when the Australians, who were still in the foothills and within sight of Kokoda, looked back the following morning. The Isurava Battle. In search of blood, the Japanese returned to Diniki. The Australians fought them off for 2 days before retreating to Isurava and establishing a defensive perimeter because they were in danger of being totally cut off. Brigadier Selwyn H. Porter, who commanded all Australians and the few Australian officered native forces in the region, and a portion of the 53rd AIF Battalion, arrived in Isurava with Lieutenant Cole, Ralph Honner. There were now 584 other ranks and 45 officers in total. At this point, the Nankai commander, Major General Tomitaro Horii, arrived at the Gona Buna beachhead with reinforcements to assume command of the attack on Port Moresby. He swiftly advanced to Kokoda with a 1,000-strong battle force. Horii's battalions broke through the outer lines and launched a full-scale onslaught toward Isurava on the morning of August 26th. One company of the 214th AIF Battalion arrived at the same time, strengthening the Australians. The remainder of the battalion was approaching across the trail with the 216th AIF Battalion. After returning to Australia from the North African Desert Campaign, these AIF soldiers were dispatched to Port Moresby almost immediately. Many Australians at the time, both in the military and in the general public, thought that Australia would be attacked when the Japanese captured Port Moresby. The Japanese attempted to outflank the Australians by advancing on nearby jungle-covered slopes, while the assault on Isurava persisted on August 27th and 28th. General Horii, who watched the action from his headquarters perched on a mountainside with a view of Isurava, was frustrated by this early setback to his plan to capture Port Moresby. 5 battalions started attacking in waves on the 29th after he called up 2 more. Every attack was halted by the Australians. However, the Japanese got closer with each attack, and eventually some Australians were fighting with boots, fists, and rifle butts. Using a Thompson submachine gun fired from his shoulder and a Bren gun fired from his hip, Corporal Charles McCallum, who was bleeding from 3 wounds, managed to hold off the Japanese at one point. Before the Australian could smash him with the Thompson, a Japanese soldier got so near that he tore an ammunition pouch from McCallum's chest. According to Australians in the area, McCallum killed at least 40 Japanese during this action. Some Japanese soldiers nearby were getting ready for another assault. They were scattered as Private Bruce Kingsbury surged in among them, brandishing grenades and a Bren rifle. Then, with the Bren and grenades in hand, he stormed one machine gun station after another, killing any Japanese he missed as he went. Several of his fellows followed him. They pushed the Japanese line back 100 meters in the process. A sniper killed Kingsbury as he ran toward another machine gun. Kingsbury was posthumously decorated with the Victoria Cross for his role in protecting battalion headquarters. The retreat in Australia. Some of the exhausted Australians fled to a ridge behind Isurava that night when they were unable to hold any longer. At the settlement of Alola, where the injured were being kept, the others retreated to a few indigenous homes. After learning that the Australians had left Isurava, the Japanese resumed their pursuit the following morning, starting what may have been the bloodiest day of battle on the Kokoda Trail. After being driven from the ridge in the afternoon, the Australians retreated to Alola amid fierce combat. The wounded started to be evacuated. While the walking wounded started to help each other as best they could, the severely injured were tied onto stretchers made of tree branches and vines and taken on a 7 to 8 day journey across some of the world's harshest terrain in the rain and muck. The remaining Australians tried to retain Alola and give the wounded as much time as possible to recover that night and the following day, but they were forced out when nightfall arrived again. To Eora, they withdrew. The trail descended 350 meters on a 45-degree slope to a brook at Eora, and the ascent was so steep that the soldiers had to crawl up the slope. At Eora, a medical team was working, operating on passing stretcher cases and the injured who had been brought in from the combat. With the use of torches, amputations, and cures were performed on a mud floor beneath a thatch roof that was pummeled by rain. Knowing that the rear guard, with the Japanese in close pursuit, would arrive by dawn, exhausted surgeons, physicians, and medical assistants toiled through the night to clear the worst patients. The final Australians arrived in the middle of the night, gathered everyone who could possibly fight, and got ready for the impending attack. Somewhere during the night, a lieutenant colonel and his headquarters vanished. The 39th Battalion survivors were tattered. Their boots were breaking apart. They were afflicted with malaria and diarrhea, and they hadn't had a change of clothes in 3 weeks. With little food to keep them going, they had been battling day and night since before Kokoda, and were now merely moving scarecrows. They removed the stretcher cases. A soldier with 2 bullet wounds in one leg and one in the other foot was one of the walking wounded. He walked crabwise up the trail as others pushed him up the slopes. Another soldier jumped and crawled along. The stump was ligatured, dressed, and wrapped in a rice sack. One leg had been blasted off below the knee. Another, his broken arm splinted on a bayonet, walked beside. The soldiers behind them occupied positions they knew they couldn't hold for very long. After a day of holding, they withdrew to Maiola, where planes had dropped food and ammunition. They continued their retreat to Kagi after eating a satisfying dinner and destroying anything they couldn't take with them, while the hungry Japanese rummaged through the stocks left at Maiola, gathering up rice that had been tossed into the mud and punctured cans of meat that had already mildewed and ruined. They took a brief break here. The Australians had left relatively little for the Japanese, who had thus far brought munitions instead of food in the hopes of seizing Australian supplies. The Ioribaiwa Ridge Battle. In order to relieve the 39th Battalion, the 227th AIF Battalion traveled from Port Moresby to Kagi. The remaining members of the 39th then turned in their automatic weapons and started the arduous trek back to Port Moresby. For the first time in 10 days or more, the Australians were able to take off their boots during the reprieve at Kagi. They discovered their feet, which one person compared to grotesque, pulpy gloves. When the socks were taken off, the skin accompanied them. "Why should we be fighting for country like this?" was a comment used by the troops to express their opinions. "We ought to be happy to hand it to the jerks from Japan." The Australians withdrew from Kagi to the village of Afogi, where they used the heights above the village to direct in 8 Bostons, Douglas A-20 Havoc bombers, and 4 Kitty Hawks to temporarily halt Japanese attacks. This gave them time to take cover on the slopes, but Japanese soldiers approached them in groups of 1 and 2, allowing themselves to be shot dead, while telling their fellows behind them where the Australians were. A mountain gun, mortars, and heavy machine guns then began to bombard the area. These attacks frequently drew the Japanese within 15 meters of the Australians before they could be forced to retreat. Once more, the Australians were driven out of Afogi by the Japanese strategy of encircling in numbers. The Australians retreated to Minari, then to Nauru, where they were continuously attacked, and finally to Ioribaiwa Ridge, since they had no positions behind them that could be defended against these tactics. The 25th Brigade of North African Veterans under Brigadier Ken Ether was getting ready to launch a counter-offensive and start driving the Japanese back at the ridge. However, the Japanese attacked Ioribaiwa Ridge right away after hearing airplanes take off and land at the town's airfield, which was so close to their target, Port Moresby. Ether and his 25th Brigade were caught up in the battle for the ridge, which lasted until September 15th and 16th. As a result, they were unable to move freely enough to launch an offensive. He requested permission to fall back across the valley to Imita Ridge and was granted it. The Japanese rushed in to obtain supplies after the Australians fled Ioribaiwa, so determined to do so that they neglected to follow the Australian rearguard. They discovered very little. An Australian ambush murdered all 40 hungry Japanese who were making their way down the ridge into the valley. The Japanese advance stopped at this point. 4 kilometers away, between Ioribaiwa Ridge and Imita Ridge, Ether's patrols now controlled the Waole Valley. Horii increased his force to 2 brigades, or roughly 5,000 fighting men, by bringing forward 1,000 reinforcements. However, the reinforcements, like the troops already on the ridge, were famished. The error of attempting to seize supplies from Australia was being driven home in full force. The Japanese, unable to continue without food and rest, buried themselves on Ioribaiwa Ridge and waited for the new troops that Horii had promised, with whom he planned to launch a last offensive all the way to Port Moresby. Retaliation on the Kokoda Path. The counterattack started on September 28, 1942, when the Japanese had built palisades on Ioribaiwa Ridge and 2 Australian 25-pounder field guns broke through them. The 25th Brigade then entered with grenades and bayonets. But there was simply anticlimax instead of warfare. The only Japanese people left were the dead, hundreds of fallen warriors who had perished from wounds, illnesses, and malnutrition. The Japanese High Command had made the decision to prioritize the Guadalcanal War over Horii's drive to Port Moresby, which was taking place in the Solomon Islands to the east. Horii received a letter telling him to retreat to the Gona Buna base, from which another attack would be launched on Port Moresby when the war for Guadalcanal was concluded, and the reinforcements he had been promised were redirected to Guadalcanal. Horii and his men and commanders were in disbelief. In the face of the onslaught, Japanese soldiers were being ordered to retreat. It was unthinkable. However, Horii dared not disregard the telegram because it was in the emperor's name. He immediately started to withdraw. Instead of withdrawing any further, several of the men and officers who were fleeing dropped out to fight to the death. With their rifles loaded, many injured and ill people remained in the hopes of taking 1 or more Australians with them when they passed away. Following them, the 25th Brigade moved in 3 prongs, 2 in the damp forest on either side, and one in the middle on the sticky mud of the Kokoda Trail. They investigated every detour and potential route the Japanese might have taken in order to follow them. Although it took a lot of time, it was essential since the locals who came out of the woods to greet them had told them of atrocities. Some were natives of New Britain, who were taken to serve as workers and porters by the Japanese. They described being worked until the bayonet's jabs were no longer able to keep them upright, at which point some of them were thrown down. Along the road, villagers related horrific tales of women being raped, shootings, and bayonettings. They discovered some Australians. One was bayoneted and chained to a tree, while the other was decapitated. The final words of General Horii. The skeletons and decaying bodies of Japanese and Australians who had perished in the conflict a few weeks earlier were scattered around Noro and Minari as the 25th continued to advance. There was a pervasive smell of rot and death. On October 8th, Horii established a defensive at Templeton's Crossing that was so formidable that the Australians believed the Japanese had been reinforced from the Gona stronghold. After being detained for 6 days, General MacArthur and other Australians accused the Australians of being slow to act. Here, they discovered that any assistance Horii might have gotten was not food. Some Japanese had turned to cannibalism, according to diaries and other evidence discovered on their bodies. Soon, the Australians were outrunning their supplies, much like the Japanese were doing the opposite. 800 native porters were hired to transport goods along the trail, although it was predicted that 3,000 were required. Each guy carried a huge burden. Aircraft dropped some supplies, but recovery rates were poor, and there was the issue of the chronically ill and injured. At Myola, a runway was set up on a dry lake bed for air evacuation of the casualties, but no planes arrived despite appeals for them. To demonstrate that it was possible, a few pilots made the landing and removed a few injured, but those who were still alive and might be able to move started to leave. The lengthy journey back started with a somber column of 226 sick and 212 war casualties. To stand behind 3 lines of defenses constructed by reserve units with armament pits brimming with heavy and light machine guns, the Japanese withdrew from Templeton's Crossing to Iora Creek. American and Australian commanders in Australia and Port Moresby accused the trailing Australians of using weak tactics, which led to the overrun of the fortifications and the subsequent push on Kokoda. They discovered that the Japanese had left Kokoda and had retreated to the defenses constructed at Oivi when they arrived there on November 2nd. Here, the Australians employed Japanese encirclement tactics, turning any open area into a killing field as small parties met and slaughtered one another in the thick, wet jungle. The battle was brutal, and the Japanese, exhausted, somehow managed to mount a counterattack. The closeness of the combat was demonstrated by the ratio of 1 Australian killed to 2 injured. Although there were many Japanese casualties, some managed to break out of the encirclement and were killed when they attempted to cross the Kumusi River. 10 kilometers off the coast, the canoe General Horii was in swept out to sea and overturned, causing him to drown. The Gona Battle. The 126th and 128th Regiments of Maj, General Edwin F. Harding's 32nd Infantry Division, were the first American troops to land in Papua on September 12, 1942. They started laying a road that was intended to outflank the Japanese at Kokoda. However, except from providing flying air support, Americans had not been involved in the campaign until the time of General Horii's passing. The arrival of American infantry in the region clarified the apparent mystery of the precipitous Japanese retreat across the Owen-Stanley Range, according to an American press account, and MacArthur's communique declared that Allied troops had won the protracted struggle for Kokoda. In the New York Times, renowned American military journalist Hanson Baldwin said that the Australians had only been spared defeat because of American infantry action. He claimed that American soldiers were hurried into action and played a crucial role in saving the day. The Japanese are currently engaged in a desperate battle for their beachhead after the Australians gave them a dose of their own medicine by outflanking them and persistently breaking into enemy lines. After the Wairopi Bridge collapsed, the Australian 16th and 25th Brigades proceeded down the Kokoda Trail to the coastal swamplands where it all started 4 months earlier, crossing the Kumusi over bridges that the engineers had made on the spot. Here, the Americans and a few reinforcements would confront the Japanese at their strongly fortified base at Gona, Buna, and Sanananda. At MacArthur's headquarters, preparations for the attack on Bunahad had already been made. A battalion of the American 126th Regiment would march through Jare and attack from the south, while the remaining 126th and 128th Regiment would fly to Wanagala and Pongani and launch an attack from there. The Australian 16th and 25th Brigades would continue to advance on Buna. With the help of Australian commandos and artillery, the Americans advanced on Buna in 3 distinct columns by the time the Australians had crossed the Kumusi. After recovering from their defeat, the Japanese were transforming their beachhead into a stronghold that would help them keep their tenuous grasp on Papua. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi of the 18th Army was in overall command of Papua New Guinea operations, and they now had about 9,000 troops on the beachhead with reinforcements. Just south of Gona village, on the morning of November 19th, advance forces of Brigadier Ether's 25th Brigade encountered Japanese fortifications. There were robust defenses behind the locations. After attacking the positions and making some progress, the Australians were forced to retreat the following day due to significant casualties. The attack claimed the lives of 204 more members of the brigade, which was now down to 736 soldiers, most of them exhausted and sickly. Currently positioned between Kokoda and Ioribaiwa, they were strengthened by Brigadier Ivan N. Doherty and his 21st Brigade, who had been in Libya, Greece, and Crete. Doherty assumed command of the Gona region. He immediately launched offensive operations with his brigade, and even though his initial attempts were unsuccessful, a string of relentless strikes forced the Japanese to abandon their fortifications. On December 9th, the settlement of Gona was taken. Nearly all of the 800-900 Japanese garrison was destroyed. 600 of their dead were buried by the brigade. I want you to either take Buna or die. The left flank of the attack had been secured by Australian operations, but the advance had become disorganized and stalled at Buna and along the Sanananda track. As the American 126th and 128th Regiments moved toward Buna along 2 coastal paths from the south, they encountered sporadic opposition before the main Japanese lines were reached. All columns will be driven through to objectives regardless of losses, MacArthur told General Thomas Blamey, the Australian commander, in order to order his land forces to attack the Bunagona sector on November 21st. MacArthur was determined to have his Americans accelerate the battle. On the morning of November 21st, Harding sent his division into the offensive, and chaos reigned for the next 9 days. When the troops initially attacked the major Buna strongholds, they were severely mauled since they were poorly led, ill-trained, and accustomed to a softer life before coming to Papua. Disappointed, MacArthur dispatched American War Corps Commander Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, who on November 30th arrived at MacArthur's makeshift headquarters at Port Moresby. "Bob, I'm placing you in command at Buna," MacArthur informed him. "Release Harding. Please dismiss any officers who refuse to engage in combat. If required, relieve battalion and regimental commanders. Assign corporals to companies and sergeants to battalions, anyone who is willing to fight. It is my desire that you take Buna or perish, and the same is true for your chief of staff. You get it?" "Yes, sir." The Buna Battle. The following day, Eichelberger reached Buna and was horrified by what he discovered. He dismissed Harding and 2 regimental commanders right away and replaced them with members of his own staff because the command structure was disorganized, the troops' morale was low, and a general malaise hung over the whole operation. On December 5th, he gave the order to launch an attack with the assistance of Australian-born Brin gun carriers. The offensive was carried out on 2 fronts, one against Buna Hamlet and the other against the formidable defenses along the New Strip airstrip to the east of the village. Although there was some success in the village area, the main garrison remained strong and heavier. American strikes were unable to breach the airfield fortifications. Eichelberger relieved the 126th Regiment with the 127th after the Yanks had lost 1827 soldiers dead, wounded, missing, and ill by December 10th. The garrison was gone when the new 127th arrived in Buna village, but the airport fortifications were still in place, and Eichelberger readied himself for another attack. He was then informed that the 18th Australian Brigade, led by Brigadier Wootten, was joining the line to assume command of the airport sector. The two 16th Armored Regiment's two highly skilled Stuart light tank soldiers would accompany the brigade. On December 17th, Wootten assumed command, bringing with him 3 American battalions. His goal was to seize control of the area around Cape Endayadere, the new strip, the old strip, and the government headquarters in Buna. The initial target was the entire coastline between New Strip and Saimemi Creek's mouth, where the Japanese were encamped in a number of strongholds. Each was a miniature fortress that was hidden and disguised. Some had steel roofs, others had concrete roofs, and some were shielded by interwoven coconut logs buried with 6 feet of earth. With 7 tanks leading the charge, the Australians launched Wootten's attack at 7 a.m. on December 18th. After the war, General Eichelberger recalled, the Americans were captivated by their extraordinary courage as they walked forward into a torrent of fire and disposed of one strong point after another. It was a courageous attack that was both stunning and emotional. It was roughly a mile from New Strip to the sea. Other Americans were tasked with mopping up, while American soldiers wheeled to the west in support. With their Tommy guns blazing in front of them, however, the young and fresh Australian veterans moved behind the tanks. Japanese positions that were hidden and far more dangerous than our patrols had suggested caught fire. Heavy machine gun fire from barricades and entrenchments was there, along with the oily stench of tracer fire. Tanks and infantrymen moved steadily through the tall, sparse coconut trees, apparently unaffected by the fierce opposition. Despite losing around 1/3 of their attacking power, the Australians managed to drive the Japanese out of their positions by the end of the first day, on a line that stretched from the sea due south to the east end of the new strip. Despite the strength of the Japanese fortifications, Wootten kept his operations moving forward and made more progress every day. An American-Australian triumph at Buna. The brigade's 3 battalions arrived at Europa Point on January 1st, 1943. 863 people had been killed, which accounted for 45% of their entire strength. Nearly the entire American 32nd Division was involved in the battle for Buna by the end, and the overall Allied losses came to about 2,870 war casualties. The Australians endured 913 of these. The Australian 18th Brigade is known to have killed 490 Japanese in the village and local government offices, and 900 Japanese east of Europa Point. It is unknown how many more were slain. Although some American and British historians believe that the U.S. forces won the battle, the Australians should at least take some of the credit. Wootten's force's action was what broke the back of the Japanese positions on the shore, despite the Americans' own desire for a swift and definitive outcome. The Sanananda Track strikes. Attention was focused on Sanananda, where the Japanese had set up their primary defensive positions astride the Sanananda Track, in an area that was a mix of dense jungle, kunai grass, and deep marsh. The left and right flanks of the Allied advance to the coast were now secure. The 16th Australian Brigade, a unit at the limit of its physical endurance following its protracted and difficult battle over the Owen Stanley Mountains, had obstinately repelled attacks on the Japanese garrison of about 6,000 troops from mid-November to mid-December 1942. The brigade's fighting strength was lowered to 50 officers and 488 other ranks when they were withdrawn out of the line in December. They were relieved by new and confident soldiers from the U.S. 126th Infantry Regiment. "You can now return home," they said to the Australians. "We're coming to clean things up." However, the malarial swamps and the fierce Japanese resistance quickly crushed this self-assured attitude. 2 Australian militia battalions from the 30th Brigade were sent to their aid, but their heavy attacks were only partially successful, and Major General George Vasey grudgingly concluded he would have to wait until Buna was destroyed before concluding the battle at Sanananda. After Buna was destroyed, it was agreed that the Americans would move on Sanananda along the coast from Buna, while the Australians would launch a frontal assault on Sanananda from the Sanananda Track. The 18th Brigade, led by Brigadier Wootten, would lead the assault. On the morning of January 12th, Wootten launched an attack against the Japanese defenses, deploying 2 battalions in a flanking movement. This led to a protracted day of bloody combat in sweltering heat and squalid swamps. The offensive appeared to be failing by midnight, but a Japanese soldier was taken prisoner early the following morning. He disclosed that only the ill and injured were left to guard the strongpoints after all Japanese soldiers who were fit were told to leave. Wootten launched an assault right away. Australian and American troops persisted in attacking the remaining defensive positions until all organized resistance stopped on January 22nd, after the 18th had taken control of the road junction that had caused the long-term delay in the advance by dark on January 14th. Japan's initial land loss. Another example of the Japanese soldiers' remarkable perseverance was their defense of Sanananda. In defending the marsh around Sanananda, they suffered about 1,600 dead and 1,200 wounded, halted the Allied advance for 2 months, and severely damaged the Australians, 600 dead and 800 wounded, and Americans, 274 dead and roughly 400 injured. Both armies suffered more casualties from illness than these numbers indicate. Approximately 2,000 soldiers participated in the Kokoda, Milne Bay, and Gona operations, and it is estimated that over 13,000 of them died in various ways. The conclusion of the Sanananda operations marked the first defeat of a Japanese ground force in World War II. Relatively few people managed to flee the combat zones to join their fellow soldiers elsewhere, and about 2,000 were evacuated by water. But the majority of the surviving Japanese perished from malnutrition, illness, and wounds, leaving their bones in Papua's jungles, swamps, and mountains. The Americans lost 29-31 during their involvement in the Buna and Sanananda area, while the Australians, who had borne the most of the combat, suffered 56-89 war casualties between July the 22nd, 1942, and January 22nd, 1943. Priceless experience for the Australian military. The Australian Army gained tactical leadership skills from the war in Papua that were invaluable to the British in Burma and later in New Guinea, at least as good as, or even better than Japanese forces, who had developed an almost superhuman reputation. The Australian soldier became a specialist in jungle combat. It is debatable whether the brutal combat and significant losses sustained in the campaign's closing phases, particularly at Buna, Gona, and Sanananda, were strategically warranted. It's possible that MacArthur, who used this tactic later in the New Guinea War, could have isolated the Japanese garrisons and allowed them to either be overrun by superior forces or wither on the vine. Regardless, the triumph in Papua raised Allied spirits, even though the Japanese High Command was beginning to realize that the invasion, capture, and garrisoning of such a large country was much beyond their capabilities. It also eliminated any possibility of the Japanese attacking Australia. Furthermore, the Australians broke the spell of the invincibility of the Japanese army, as noted by Field Marshal Slim,